Okay, so I am no longer a professor of history. I was from 2008 over there at Eastern Florida State when it was BCC to just last year, 2021, December 2021. And I also taught middle and high school history from 2000 to 2018. And started actually teaching middle school after I retired. You know, someone offered the position to me and I said yes. And I had a blast teaching middle schoolers history. And I had fun because I didn't know I was supposed to be afraid of them. So, you know, we get along great together because, as my wife would probably tell you, and as you found out, I'm very much like a kid. So all I have to do is ask them, what would I want to hear? And then I know, right? So this particular lesson focuses really on one big question, one big issue, and that is, can Hollywood do good history movies? And the corollary to that is, are they even supposed to? Is that really a fair question to ask? So, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you some clips from history movies, some of which you're very familiar with, some of which you're not, and I'm going to be talking about this issue. What is fair to expect from a history movie? I'm not talking a documentary, I'm talking about big feature films, right, with big actors and actresses, right? And so some of you probably have favorite history movies that you've seen, like what, for example? Tell me some movies, and there are so many of them here.
The Longest Day.
The Longest Day, yeah, I'm going to be mentioning that.
Band of Brothers.
Band of
Band of Brothers. Mm-hmm.
Aren't these all driven by profit?
Well, that's an important consideration. We're going to talk about that too. Don? Torah. You know, I was growing up and I watched them film that in Honolulu. I was 13 years old, and watching those aircraft fly in formation, the ones that were former Navy and Army trainers that they remodeled to look exactly like the torpedo planes, the dive bombers, and the fighters, the Zeros, Kates, and Vals, and they would fly in formation low over the island. And I was 13 years old, and I was building all the models, and I was playing the games, and I was reading all the books, and then you see these flying overhead like that. Wow. So, yeah, okay, those are good. Other movies?
The Band of Brothers.
Band of Brothers, series. What else? Other perhaps?
For Private Ryan.
Okay, Saving Private Ryan. Yeah, you're covering a lot of my favorites, but what about movies that maybe don't necessarily have a war theme to them that are history movies?
Casablanca?
Yeah, there you go, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, what, Casablanca? Lots of them.
I guess Cleopatra.
Yeah, Cleopatra, there's one. Absolutely. So we're gonna be dealing with this particular topic. Now, this was a movie that got some critiques from historians. Because the plot of the movie had to do, any of you seen this one? The movie dealt with the voting rights march there in Selma, Alabama in March of 1965. And African Americans were in some counties in Alabama over 80% of the population, and they had only a handful that could actually vote. So what they were wanting to do is actually get their 14th and 15th Amendment, particularly 15th Amendment rights. So they were going to march from Selma down the highway to Montgomery, the state capital, and Martin Luther King Jr. was going to speak on right in front of the Capitol. And of course, this was broadcast all over television, all over the country, when state troopers and police and volunteers attacked the marchers on horseback with clubs, with tear gas. It was known as Bloody Sunday. They weren't going to allow them to march. It was a very segregated society, as some of you might know. But some people watching this movie, who know the history, looked at the movie and saw that it seemed like President Lyndon Johnson was trying to hold Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights back, trying to tell King, don't march, you know, it's going to be terrible, you shouldn't do it. And there was conflict taking place between King and LBJ, which did not happen. And so some folks who knew the history looked at the movie and said, hey, they're making LBJ look like a jerk, and he wasn't. As a matter of fact, he was just the opposite. He was pushing ahead on civil rights. So why would they do this? Why would they do something like this that was so very blatantly anti-historical?
Political.
What do you have to have a good story? You have to have a plot. You have to have conflict, Maureen, right? You have to have conflict. Sometimes you have to generate the conflict where there might not be any. You have to have someone who maybe is a good guy, but is he really a good guy? Or is he going to hold the good guys back? You see what I'm talking about? And so sometimes this is what happens in a Hollywood movie. And so people walk away saying this was a terrible movie. But there were other things at play in this movie too. This movie was made at a period of time when many Americans felt as if some African Americans were actually losing their right to vote. And so the movie was made to kind of portray a time in American history where this actually occurred. Why should it matter? Well, for one thing, we get a lot of our history from movies, don't we? You talk to folks about an event, and even visuals that we get. When we picture, for example, what it must have been like on Omaha Beach. My goodness, the visuals in The Longest Day, but even more so, Saving Private Ryan, really. I mean, when I watched Saving Private Ryan, I could not get up at the end of the movie. I was literally frozen to the seat because the graphics were so very jarring and so very emotional. You know, for the first time, I really had a tiny little thimbleful of understanding what these people must have gone through. And my appreciation for them ran even deeper. So we do this. We get our history from movies. And movies can open up worlds that our imaginations can't. You can read about what it must have been like in the Roman Empire in the days of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and his relationship with Egypt and all of the political machinations going on. But when you see it up front, when you see an entire Roman legion or a fleet, it does something that maybe a book doesn't necessarily do, does it? Right? Our imagination, and the other thing too, every time a history movie comes out, it seems like books on the topic sell like wildfire. You look at Amazon sales every time a really good history movie comes out, and you're going to see this. There's a mini-series happening right now on Apple TV called Masters of War. It's kind of like Band of Brothers, only in the air. It has to do with the bombing raids over Germany, and it's also done by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks. And I will bet you money that as people watch the sales of the books dealing with the aerial campaign over Germany in World War II, the B-17s, the B-24s, watch the sales of the books go up. So movies are really helpful in sparking our interest, and they can inspire us actually to change history. The movie Schindler's List. How many of you have seen that movie? Well, when the movie, of course, after the movie came out, detailing how Oskar Schindler had helped to rescue so many of these Jews who worked in his factories, there was a Swiss guard in a bank in Switzerland, and he happened to be in the vault one day, and he happened to notice piles and piles of paperwork that was getting ready to be shredded. And when he examined those records, they were records of Jews who were victims of the Holocaust and their fortunes that they had earned that were kept in Swiss banks, and those records were about to be destroyed. So he went to the authorities and probably saved a lot of people's livelihood. Why did he do that? He saw the movie and was inspired. Now that happens, of course, in a good sort of way. It can happen in a negative sort of way too. Richard Nixon loved the movie Patton, and he had private screenings of it in the White House, and it's been said that he was so inspired by Patton's take charge, offensive, attack, attitude that George C. Scott played so well in that movie. It was one of my favorites. How many of you have seen it? Yeah. It's great. I saw it when it first came out in the theaters. Loved it ever since. At one point, I even had the speech memorized. Yeah, I was even in high school, right? Imagine that. But Nixon, it's said that Nixon's decision to widen the Vietnam War by attacking strongholds, Viet Cong and NVA strongholds in Cambodia, was inspired by this movie. So filmmakers have to consider a lot when they're making a movie. And yes, money. You mentioned that making money is actually very, very important, Don. I think you said that, and you're absolutely right, because if you're making a historical drama, it's expensive. Why?
Cast.
Yeah.
The planes, like in the...
Yes. Yeah. The equipment.
And people.
Costumes.
Yeah.
Props.
Lawrence of Arabia had. They covered the area with people.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
As far as you could see.
If you're going to have to hire lots and lots and lots of extras if you're trying to create that, and so it's expensive, right? And the second thing that a filmmaker has to consider, other than the fact that this is really expensive, are we going to get our money's worth? Is sometimes people can't really relate to an event that might take place 2,000 years in the past, like in Cleopatra. And so an emotional hook is a little bit more difficult. That's why sometimes you will see movies that seem to almost kind of make a sort of a contemporary slant in relationships. Or for example, language. One of the things that I've noticed about more recent movies and television shows about the Old West is the language has become more authentic. Like News of the World with Tom Hanks.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, good movie. But the language was strange in a way because it was authentic mid-19th century language. You know, you compare Gunsmoke with the more modern True Grit and more modern Westerns, the language is really, really different. Because, again, the makers of Gunsmoke had compromised. They used current day language. But you know, more and more authenticity demands more and more research, and that costs money, and sometimes finding an emotional hook, and sometimes the audience may think the film is phony, or staged, or the acting is bad. So sometimes it's hard to make history relevant to modern audiences without making some compromises. The filmmaker just has to decide how many compromises are we going to have to make. So.